Hi, I'm Mike Chandler, bringing you another episode of our Dogwood Review. Today, we are very blessed to have with us an attorney from Fayetteville, North Carolina, James Baker. James is kind of a individual that has got a lot of expertise in a lot of different areas, and I think, James, you would refer to you as being a historical buff. Is that how you want that?
Yeah, that's
right. Okay, it's historical history buff. But James is really more than that. He's being a little bit shy. He's served as an FAO. That's a foreign area officer in the military, and he had a tremendous amount of experience in Europe and the Middle East, and we're going to play on that today. But let's talk about what our purpose for today's session is. There is a global phenomenon which we call populism that is really going throughout the world, and we think that this populist movement was the key behind the most recent election of Donald Trump. We're going to talk about this and how this ties economically with our own country, and how important this is, and how deeply embedded this movement is. Welcome, James.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. James is really a specialist on this populism. I'm going to let him talk to you a little bit about this movement, and we'll go into some of the things that we believe is similar to the Trump movement.
The interesting thing about populism, it's not really on the left politically or on the right. It's not tied to an ideology. It's more a way of thinking about politics, sort of an us versus them mentality. The idea of the common people versus the elite or versus the establishment, and that can happen on the right or the left. For example, Bernie Sanders, his movement had a populist dimension, except the common people for that movement was defined as students saddled down with student loans versus elite bankers and financiers who wanted to extract every dime that was owed to them. So it's not really something on the left or the right. It's more a way of looking at politics. And it's not limited to the United States, as I think you implied a minute ago. It's all over the world, and it's not really limited to this point in history. There have been populist movements in the U.S. going all the way back to Andrew Jackson.
That's interesting you should mention Andrew Jackson, because there's a huge similarity in the Trump movement and Andrew Jackson. For instance, one of the things we talked about earlier is that Andrew Jackson was one of Trump's, for lack of better words, heroes. He had probably the most effective populist movement in the United States since Donald Trump, actually.
As a matter of fact, in January this year, 2017, shortly after Trump was inaugurated, he had a portrait of Andrew Jackson hung in the Oval Office.
That's interesting. I also heard that he went to Andrew Jackson's birthday back in March 15th.
I think.
In Nashville, and he laid a wreath
where Jackson is buried.
That's correct. I just so apparently he's been a idol of Trump's for some time.
Interesting to note that Jackson's first cabinet was made up largely of business people.
A lot of similarities.
Jackson also relied on close relatives and friends for his inner circle. Some interesting parallels there. But there have been other populist movements in the U.S. besides Andrew Jackson. In the 1890s, there was William Jennings Bryan, who sided with the farmers against the gold standard. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. Wanted to go back to silver. And then more recently, I think it's fair to think of Pat Buchanan and H. Ross Perot as populists.
Oh, they clearly were, and what a disruptive campaigns they were in 1992. They certainly disrupted the political agenda for that year, and certainly broke Bush's heart, because Perot actually got better than 20% of the vote as an independent candidate.
And back in 1968 and 72, we could call George Wallace a populist, for that matter.
Yeah, and I want to go back to something we said earlier. It's very important to understand that this populist movement is the common man versus the elite. It's an uprising from the ground level up, and I think that's the way Andrew Jackson looked at it. Mm-hmm. He said it was government should be run from the people, not from the government down, from the people up, and I think that's important, because that's the one thing that all of these things have in common. You know, we talk about the global situation, and Brexit. For those of you that don't know what Brexit is, the UK voted a year ago yesterday to exit the European Union. Well, there was specific reasons for that. But the biggest reason, and this is one of the things I've tried to do, I've tried to take all of these movements and look to see what we have as far as similarities. And one of the things is immigration. We know that was a plank for Donald Trump, but the Brexit movement entirely was, I shouldn't say entirely, but a great deal of the Brexit movement was on the open borders that are mandated by the European Union, and they had no control over their borders. And we know what has happened in not only England most recent, but we've had these things in. These terrorist actions throughout Europe because of the open borders. We think that's a great part of that. So that has been a big issue.
That's a common thread between American populism nowadays and the current version of European populism.
Yeah. Another similarity all of them had was trade agreements, and how they've been talking about this anti-globalism, and what we've seen happen is trade deals are being unwound, and people are putting their own common people first, and we see that with the trade agreements that Trump has talked about, but also we see that in Europe.
Yes,
in a major
economic sovereignty is a big issue in European populism. And for that matter, in Trump's version of American populism. So you've got immigration and protection of borders, you've got economic sovereignty, but there's also a dimension both in Europe and the U.S. nowadays about the concentration of huge wealth in just a few hands.
Oh, that's such a great point.
One person even wrote an article called "The Have-Yachts versus the Have-Nots." And it's a disparity in wealth that is shocking when you look at the numbers.
That person he's referring to is actually Stephen King, who's got this new book out called Brave New World. One of the best reads I've had this summer, and I encourage everybody to read it. They want to look into this even farther.
Mm-hmm. When you look at the numbers, the relative small number of people who control a huge proportion of the world's economy, it's just shocking.
You know, it absolutely is. Let me give you some statistics regarding that. First of all, globally, almost half the world's wealth is controlled by 1% of the population.
And the richest 85 people in the world own as much as the bottom half of the world's population, supposedly.
It's incredible, absolutely incredible, and it's not getting better. In fact, globally, 7 out of 10 people were affected by the rise in concentration of wealth and income. I'd say 7 out of 10 have been negatively affected by the concentration of wealth.
And 10% of Americans own 75% of American wealth.
It's incredible.
It
Absolutely.
and that trend has been getting worse and worse over the past few years.
Well, let's go a step further. Did you know that 20%, the top 20%, own 95% of the wealth in the United States? That's a big number.
That is.
That's a huge number.
Wealth is falling for the vast majority of the population, but it's growing for a tiny sliver of the population.
And why this is so important, because this has suppressed the middle class. You know, we've talked frequently, you know, I go back to the implementation of estate taxation. Estate taxation was actually, when it was first implemented, was nothing more than a vehicle to redistribute wealth that wanted to ensure a middle class. Because a two-class society ends in revolution, i.e. what happened in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution is probably a great example. But that was back in the 50s when they implemented estate taxation. That was kind of the thing they were wanting to do. Now I'm really a proponent of free enterprise, so I'm not going to take a stand on these issues, but I think it's important to know that well, what was it Justice Brandeis? What was the quote that Justice Brandeis had to say? I think this is important.
Something along the lines of, we can have a democracy or we can have a concentration of huge wealth in a few hands, but we can't have both.
I think that was very profound, actually, and I think that has given a lot of the movement that we've had here in the United States. The grassroots movement for the really, in my opinion, elected Trump.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what have we had? Let's talk about the U.S. a little bit more. The elitist movement.
First of all, the media and the pollsters totally missed what was happening out in the country.
Globally, yes.
Yes, not just in the U.S., but globally.
And, you know, there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, this electorate supporting Trump, some of which have never voted before, and one of the things pollsters have to do is they only call, to keep them from having to make too many calls, they only call those most likely voters. And how do they do that? Well, they go into the records and they find out who's voting and who's not, and they call those to ask them for polls. Well, they missed a good bit of this market. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that this group has, or this other trait that this group has, is, you know, if you pick up the phone, and I'm kind of like this too, you pick up the phone and call and want my political opinions, I'm not going to disclose it to a poll.
I think a lot of people are less than candid with pollsters. Why should they be totally open about their political views if they feel the person on the other end of the phone is going to look down on them or make them feel small or insignificant or uninformed? Why should you be completely candid with somebody like that?
It's a good point. You know, I'm kind of, I'm not so far out there that I believe in the end of the country and that kind of attitude, but I'm private when it comes to my vote. It's between me and the ballot box. And, you know, I certainly don't want to give that out. And the point here is that here in the United States, they missed it. The media missed the polls big time. They were wrong because they had Clinton winning this hands down. But not only here, you know,
the Brexit referendum.
The Brexit referendum, and I can tell you, I was as guilty as anybody because I spend a lot of time on the international financial markets and those networks. Well, that entire group was announcing that the Brexit movement was dead, and within a week, that whole thing had turned around and the Brexit movement was real, and United Kingdom elected to withdraw from the EU, which they're going through now.
David Cameron and many other Remainers, as they call them in the UK, George Osborne, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, and others, insisted on looking at Brexit through a financial prism, as if everybody wants money, everybody wants material goods, and they base their arguments solely on financial considerations. One lesson I think that has to come out of the Brexit result is that people are motivated by things other than financial numbers. They are motivated by public safety. They are motivated by a sense of national identity, for example. These
UK
things,
particularly. I
yes.
mean, they've had a history of being a very proud country and very, protective of their rights.
So these things are important to people in addition to financial considerations.
This movement, this Brexit movement that we're talking about, again, a populist movement, is rampant throughout Europe. We just had and you and I have talked about this, the election in France. Well,
Both of the formerly established parties were
lost.
excluded from the second round.
They sure were. And two relative newcomers. Now, Macron's been around a long time in other, in other positions, but Le Pen, and he's the French specialist, so I'll let him pronounce their names.
Le Pen and her father's party
Mm-hmm.
have been around for a while.
Yeah, and she wanted to close the borders. That was a big issue. Immigration was a huge issue for her.
There are millions of Muslim voters now in France.
Yeah, I heard a comment the other day that now that these open borders has, and understand, I'm not knocking the plight of the refugees, but within that movement of the refugees moving into Europe, unfortunately, I think we've got an awful large amount of not so good folks, and that's apparent today because we've had all of those terrorist activities.
You've got genuine political persecution that produces political refugees. You've also got economic refugees. You've also got those who would use the refugee movement as cover for nefarious activities.
Yeah, and now I've heard them refer to the toothpaste. It's like now because these borders have been open for so long, it's kind of like putting toothpaste back into the tube. It's very difficult, so it's an issue. But this is a driving force throughout Europe. Italy, who will be soon having some elections in the near term. There's a huge movement.
The Northern League.
The Northern League, absolutely, and they're making strides. So we got a movement in Italy, we got movements in France, actually have movements in Germany.
And in Spain, the Podemos.
Absolutely, Spain, and which brings a whole new kind of perspective to this populist movement. If you take the southern Mediterranean, we talked about Brexit, which is Greek leaving the EU. Well, Greek has got a lot of financial problems. And Brussels, which is the home of the European Union, and Frankfurt, which is Merkel's home, and they put pressure on Greece, austerity pressures and demands that have really kept Greece from pulling out of the economic dive that they're currently in. So
there's an added dimension to all of this within Europe, which is the increasing dominance of Germany. What position Brussels takes is often, in the perception of some, dictated by Berlin. To what extent is the European Union becoming a greater Germany, Großdeutschland? And will that imbalance be exacerbated by the departure of Britain? Probably so, at least in perception, perhaps in reality as well.
Again, too, here it is where government has enforced, or really has passed down to the common man throughout Europe, dictated basically what they would do. And there's been a rebellion, and that has gone throughout Europe, as we've just mentioned, and continues to this day. It's a real movement, and that same movement is kind of what we had here in the United States.
And so all of these political developments are going to affect the trade pacts, and through those trade pacts influence national economies as well as the global economy,
Sure.
and thereby influence investments and your job of managing money.
You know, the Trump movement was all about pulling in the items that block us from having an industrial manufacturing base. And what I mean by that is we've had NAFTA, that we saw our manufacturing base go away, completely go away. We lost jobs. We lost our manufacturing base. Now, there's a couple reasons for that, but again, too, keep in mind it was top down. It wasn't bottom up. We lost our base for our manufacturing base because of two things. Number one, our corporate tax rates have been way high. You know, where we were 35%, most other places where these companies went to, the corporate tax rates were 15%, and they also had cheaper labor. But we allowed that to happen. We set them up to do. You can't blame the corporations for that. You know, economically, it was a pretty sound movement. But Trump is wanting to bring that back. To heck with these programs. We got to get these companies to come back to the United States, and it's all about jobs. Again, common man lost. This whole concept is from the top down. The elitists push the jobs away from us, and he's trying to bring them back to support the common man. That's this populism movement.
So politics ties into trade, ties into finance, and ties into the investments that you advise people to make.
Certainly.
Or not to make.
You know, our GDP growth has been very, very low for many, many, many years. We have not had any wage growth. In fact, let me give you another statistic. Since 2007, we've seen a huge movement in the percentage of income owned by the top 1%. All of the income growth from 2007 through 2010, or not all, but 95% of the income growth was given to the top 1% in this country. That's a scary number.
Yes,
Scary number.
I would agree.
So this is kind of what we're telling you today is this movement is real. It's not, there's really something behind this, and it is clearly driven from the common man up and not government or the elitist down. And, you know, more I read about this, even if Trump had not been elected, I think this movement was coming. When the middle class is crammed down with no income growth for an extended period of time, with little wealth, ultimately they're going to revolt. And I think that's part of the movement that you see today. Well, that kind of sums up what we wanted to bring forward today. And it's all about the global populist movement that we think was instrumental in getting Trump elected. The economic plight of the common man is clearly the driving force behind this. Thanks for tuning in today, and we look forward to coming back in the real near future. Thank you so much for coming, James. I appreciate your input's been tremendous.
Thanks for having me.